Hello everybody, I want to take you through a demo today where I show you a couple of the new features that we have in Rome. And I want to go ahead and use a custom case where we're going to create an invoice. And I'm going to start with a work order. And what we're going to do on work orders, a few people don't know this, but what you can do on any ServiceNow task, such as a work order or a work order task, you can do chargebacks. So you can actually create expense lines that are attached to the tasks. In the case of a work order, an expense line could be generated from a part that you use on the work order, or it could be generated from labor. And there's automatic things that create those expense lines, or you can create your own workflows to create those expense lines for you. Also, a lot of people don't know in ServiceNow is there is a cost application that's included with any subscription on the platform. And the cost application lets you have rate cards, so you can bill back for contracts or you can bill back for different CIs. If you're charging a certain amount per month, you can say, okay, a server costs $8 a month. So go ahead and look at all the servers and create expense lines for them. And all the expense lines for these tasks or for the CIs that you're charging back for, they all land in this cost module in the same table. They all go to the expense line table. Now today I'm not going to talk about how to generate these expense lines for the tasks. What I want to talk about is how to create an invoice after these expense lines are created. I have a few work orders, and the work orders have attachments to them. And these work orders have attachments where they're billing certain things, replace crystal fault paired sensors. These are what's getting charged for. I know the work order they're getting charged for on, and I know how much they cost. I want to do a monthly chargeback where I create an invoice for certain departments and bill those departments back. I created a custom application in Studio, and it's a pretty simple application. There's really just three things to it. There's a table called Invoice. There is a forms for those invoice tables and things. The only other two things besides the table, there's a workflow. So I'll show you Flow Designer, and there's an action. Sometimes these are called spokes. So there's an action where we can call an API and actually build our invoice in a PDF. Those are the two things I'm going to really focus on during this demonstration. Let's go take a look at this create invoice. We'll start with it, create invoice in Flow Designer. What I want to do is I want to create a monthly, this is an invoice builder actually, the scope. I want to create a monthly bill for all the work orders for every single department in my organization. And that's my use case. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have a trigger that kicks off my workflow monthly. And then I'll look up all the department records. So there's nothing fancy about this query, just get every department out of my table. After I look up all my department records, I want to create a couple variables in here. And this is a relatively new feature where I can create a variable that I'll be able to use throughout the workflow. And in a variable here, I'm getting a period end and a period start. And I created little scripts for these periods to actually get the glide dates out of them. And those scripts will actually bring back the first day of the month and the last day of the month. So if I run this on today's December 3rd, it will go back to the November time frame and pick November 1st to November 30th as my period end and period start. I create those flow variables. I'm able to loop through all the department records. I have 40-something departments in there. So it's going to go through, and every department we got up here, this is going to loop through those departments. And then for each of those records, what it's going to do, it's going to go into the expense line table, and it's going to say, do I have, in that expense line table, do I have between my start date and end date, and for this department that I'm looping through, do I actually have a task in there where the source table that created the expense line is a work order? I can do this for incident just as easily, or a work order task just as easily as well. Now I have all the expense lines for this one department that I'm currently looping through. If I find any expense lines for that department, so if it's greater than 0, then what I want to do is I want to create an invoice record. And this is creating a record in my new invoice table. So this is my custom table that I built that's in that scope. On this invoice, I'm going to update the field, the bill due department, the start date, the end date. After I create that invoice record, now I want to call my action. This is my custom action that I defined. And this is the action that's going to call our API for the PDF, to create our PDF. This is new in Rome. I'm going to also include a link to the API instructions in case you want to do other things with PDFs, but I'll show you some really cool stuff today on the one that I'm using. In order to get back to this create invoice action, I want to go up to my home again, and instead of looking at flows this time, I want to come over to actions. Now in my actions, just like I looked at my flow in that application, you'll see that Invoice Builder is our application and Generate Invoice Action is the action that we're going to call. With an action, what we want to do when we start off is create the inputs. These inputs is what you'll eventually see when you're using the action inside the flow. So these are the inputs here. So when I put Generate Invoice Action, it's the action, the task record ID, the Generate PDF name. These are all the things that we're filling in when we pass it to the action. And so now that I have all these things, I can move on to my script step. And the script step is where I'm going to take those variables and I'm going to do certain things down here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is code that's right out of some of the examples in the API. I'm going to link the API in the bottom of the comments of this video. Creating a document in the beginning, a PDF document. I'm just putting some text in that document just so we can see the different text and how it's used. I'm defining some colors, I'm defining a table here, and then what I'm doing with the table is you'll see that we're going to loop through. And if you remember in the flow, we passed a set of expense lines. I loop through those expense lines that I passed to my Generate Invoice Action one by one, and we're going to create a table. So the table is only going to be as long as the amount of actions I have. If I have 100 actions, we're going to have 100 rows in the table. If I have 2 expense lines, we're only going to have 2 rows in the table. That's what's really nice about this, is that it's dynamic. I don't have to make a static table and populate it. What I'm also doing here as I loop through is I'm calculating my amount total. So off every one of these expense records, I'm iterating on that amount total. At the end of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this table to the document that I created in the beginning. I'm also going to add those paragraphs, the paragraph 3 and the paragraph 1, just so you can see where I would put extra text. If I wanted to put a header on my table or a footer on my table, this is just going to demonstrate how you would do that, and it's just placeholders for it for now. Save that attachment. So this is where I'm actually taking that task record ID in the beginning and the task table. That's where I'm actually getting it, and I'm attaching that document to that task. And then in the end, what we're going to do is we're going to have an output. We're going to pass the invoice amount back to our flow. If you remember in our flow, after I get this Generate Invoice Action back, it's going to go ahead and update the invoice record that I created. And now it's going to pass back that invoice amount from our action. It's going to get passed back so I can update that invoice record. So now let's take a look at this flow in action. If you remember from the studio, I created a table called Invoice. When you create a table, what you're going to do is you're also going to create a module for it. So there's a module called Invoices. And if I go back to my navigator, I should be able to find that in there. So you should see the invoice and the invoices table. If I click on the invoices table, you'll notice I don't have any rows in that table right now. And what I want to do is go back to my flow designer, and I'm going to go ahead and test my create invoice flow. So when I go ahead and test it, it's going to go ahead and run through all those records, and we'll have a nice debug here to look at and see how our new flow executed. Once I click on this, the test is finished. It's going to go ahead and show me exactly what it did. So it looped through 43 departments. And you can see on here that they evaluated the false. I believe if I go up on here, I think I start getting hits on my 16th or 17th departments. So when I get up to my, there it is, my 17th department, you'll notice that I start to have actions that happen here. So on my 17th department, it actually found records. So it found 2 records in there. And after it found those 2 records, what it did, it created an invoice record for me. So here it created an invoice record in my invoice table that we just looked at that was empty. And after it created that record, it went through and it created the invoice. So it generated the invoice action. And you can see here it passed 2 expense records back to my invoice action. It also gave me the sysID of that invoice record that I just created. And then it also returned the total amount after that invoice action generated. And this total amount is what I'm doing in my workflow and how I'm updating that invoice record. Right? And then in the end, it updated that record. So I passed that amount back that we just talked about, that 377.60, and it generated my invoice. So now that I ran that flow, if I go back to my invoices table and I click on my all to refresh the invoices, I should see 2 new invoices in here that were created, one for engineering and one for customer support. If I open up one of those invoices, I should now see an attachment on the top with that title that I generated for my start date and an end date. So you can see that the record started on the 11/1 and it ended on 11/30, the last day of November. If I open up this invoice, this is my API for the PDF. And that, like I said, this is new in Rome as well as those variables are new as well. But this is the table that it created for me. So you can see here we changed our colors and we added those amounts. And in the end, I put a line where I calculated the total amount. These are the other paragraphs I put in there just as placeholders so that you can see that I could add some text in here or even some HTML and I could move those around and convert them myself. Now the other thing I would probably want to pass back here is I would probably want to take that invoice number in our invoice table, and I want to take that invoice number and I want to pass it to here so I can put an invoice number in the upper right hand corner. So what I would do for that is I would go back into my flow designer and I would take this flow and I would change my action, my generate invoice action, put invoice number in here as another field in my action, and then I could take the invoice record, right, generated in step 6, I would be able to take that invoice record here and I would be able to use the number off that invoice record and pass that back to my function. And then I could simply put it on the top in the upper right hand corner of my invoice if I want to. So use the unique number on that invoice table to go ahead and generate a unique invoice number for yourself. I did put this on a Google Drive, so the Invoice Builder custom app, which is just these 3 little things so you can see how to use the API. I'm going to put a link to this so that you can download this update set and you can look up in your documentation how do you upload a local update set. And I'm also going to put a link to the API documentation in case you want to do other things with the PDF Creator API. Hopefully this is useful. Have fun creating your invoices. Thank you very much.